The air in the emergency room was a toxic cocktail. It smelled of antiseptic, bleach, and the metallic tang of blood, all underscored by the faint, sour scent of human fear. Monitors beeped in a frantic, disjointed symphony. The fluorescent lights hummed a merciless, flat note, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the hurried movements of doctors and nurses. It was a place of controlled chaos, a world balanced on the knife's edge between life and death. Ilara Vance moved through this world like a ghost. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched, as if trying to shrink herself into non-existence. Her mousy brown hair was pulled back into a severe, functional bun, but a few stray strands always seemed to escape, falling across the faint, silvery scar that cut a thin line just above her right temple. A scar she constantly, subconsciously, tried to hide. Her assigned duties were the ones no one else wanted. Stocking the supply closets, changing the linens on empty gurneys, mopping up spills that were more than just saline. She was the new nurse, the quiet one, the one who seemed perpetually lost in a fog of uncertainty. Her movements were hesitant, her hands sometimes fumbled with a simple IV bag, and her voice, when she used it, was a breathy whisper that was easily swallowed by the ER's din. The other nurses saw her as slow, perhaps incompetent, a charity case hired out of pity. They traded whispered jokes and exasperated sighs behind her back. She felt their eyes on her, sharp with judgment, but she never looked up to meet their gaze. She just did her work, methodically, silently, her face a mask of placid neutrality. Dr. Alistair Finch was the king of this chaotic kingdom. Chief of trauma surgery, he strode through the ER like a conquering hero, his expensive shoes clicking with authority on the linoleum floors. He was brilliant, his hands capable of miracles, his diagnostic skills legendary, but his ego was a malignancy, metastasized and consuming everything around him. He feasted on the fear and adulation of his subordinates, and he had an artist's talent for cruelty. He spotted Ilara near a supply cart, her back to him as she carefully counted gauze pads. He needed a target, a small release of the pressure building inside him from a surgery that hadn't gone as smoothly as he'd have liked. She was perfect. "Nurse!" he barked. The word was a weapon. Ilara flinched, her shoulders tightening. She turned around slowly, her eyes fixed on the third button of his pristine white coat. "Yes, Dr. Finch?" Her voice was barely audible. "I need a number 10 scalpel, a DeBakey forceps, and a suture kit. Now." He didn't really need them. He just wanted to see her scurry. He wanted to watch her fail. Ilara nodded and turned to the trauma cart. Her hands, which had been so steady moments before, now seemed clumsy. She fumbled with the latch on a drawer. Bin, a young nurse who orbited Finch like a sycophantic moon, snickered quietly. Chloe, a junior nurse who had once offered Ilara a kind word, looked down at her shoes, her cheeks flushing with shame. Ilara pulled out the requested items and placed them on a sterile tray. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out to him. Finch snatched the scalpel from the tray, holding it up to the harsh light. "This," he said, his voice dripping with condescending theatricality, "is a number 11 blade, not a 10. Can you see the difference? Or are numbers and shapes too complex for you?" Ilara stared at the blade. It was a 10. She was certain of it. She had checked it twice. But to argue was unthinkable. It would only make it worse. I'm sorry, doctor." "Sorry doesn't stop a patient from bleeding out, does it?" Finch sneered. "Sorry doesn't fix incompetence." He made a gesture of disgust, and with a flick of his wrist, he backhanded the tray. It clattered to the floor. The metal instruments rang out like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet bay. They skittered across the tiles, coming to rest in a puddle of something indeterminate. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared. Finch looked down at the mess, then at Ilara, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Clean that up," he commanded, "and try not to contaminate the entire floor while you're at it." He turned and walked away, his entourage of residents and sycophantic nurses trailing in his wake. The normal sounds of the ER slowly resumed, but the humiliation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Ilara knelt, her knees cracking softly. She picked up the forceps, her face impassive. She saw her reflection in the polished steel, a pale, frightened woman with haunted eyes. She meticulously gathered the tools, placing them in a basin for sterilization. She did not cry. She did not rage. She simply cleaned up the mess, just as she was told, her spirit retreating to a small, fortified place deep inside her, where no one, not even a man like Alistair Finch, could ever reach. She was used to cleaning up messes. It was what she did. It was all she was good for. The night wore on, a slow crawl of routine misery. A broken arm from a fall, a suspected heart attack in Bay 3, a child with a high fever. Ilara moved from one menial task to the next, a silent cog in the great grinding machine of the hospital. She refilled the saline drips, changed the biohazard bags, and wiped down a gurney, the scent of industrial cleaner sharp in her nostrils. She could still feel the phantom sting of Finch's public scorn. It was a familiar ache, one she had carried for years, long before she had ever stepped foot in this hospital. It was the price of her quiet life, the price of her penance. She accepted it, just as she accepted the low pay and the long hours. Anonymity was a sanctuary, and humiliation was the rent she paid to live there. She caught Margaret, one of the senior nurses, watching her from across the room. Margaret had been a nurse for 30 years. She had seen doctors like Finch come and go. Her expression was a mixture of pity and frustration. She knew what Finch did was wrong, but she also knew the cost of speaking up. A mortgage, 2 kids in college, a pension to protect. So she stayed silent, a coward in her own eyes. And her silence was a form of complicity that ate at her soul. She quickly looked away when Ilara met her gaze. The calm, if one could ever call it that, was shattered by the shriek of sirens. Not one or two, but a chorus of them, growing louder, converging on the hospital like wolves on a kill. The charge nurse's voice cut through the air. Multiple casualty incident. Pile up on the I-5. They're saying 15, maybe 20 vehicles. All hands on deck. The ER erupted. The controlled chaos became pure, unadulterated pandemonium. Doctors and nurses scrambled, preparing the trauma bays. Carts were rolled into position. The air crackled with a new, sharper energy. This was the test. This was the crucible. Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. In these moments, her uselessness felt most acute. She was always in the way, a clumsy obstacle in the path of people who knew what they were doing. She retreated to the supply linen closet, her designated safe space, and began folding scrubs, a mindless, repetitive task to keep her hands busy and her mind quiet. The first wave of patients arrived. Paramedics burst through the doors, shouting vitals and injury reports. The sounds of pain, of guttural moans and sharp cries, filled the air. Finch was in his element now. He stood in the center of the main trauma bay, a conductor orchestrating his symphony of salvation. He was magnificent, decisive, his earlier cruelty replaced by a laser-focused professionalism. He barked orders, and people jumped to obey. "Get me a chest tube in Bay 1. Page orthopedics for the compound fracture in 2. Where's that O-negative blood I called for?" Ilara stayed out of the way, ferrying supplies, her movements small and contained. She watched from the periphery, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a rhythm she hadn't felt in a very long time. Then, another gurney was wheeled in. It was pushed by a harried-looking paramedic who seemed overwhelmed. "We found this one about 50 yards from the main wreckage," he explained to the nearest nurse. "No ID. John Doe. Looks like a vagrant who got caught in the crossfire. Unresponsive. BP is dropping." The man on the gurney was covered in grime. His clothes were torn and dirty. He had a thick, unkempt beard, and his hair was matted with what looked like dried mud and blood. He fit the description of a homeless man perfectly. Finch gave the gurney a cursory glance, his lip curling in distaste. He was busy triaging a woman in a designer coat who had a broken wrist and was complaining loudly. The John Doe was a distraction, a piece of human debris washed up by the tide of the accident. "Blunt force abdominal trauma, probably a lacerated spleen," Finch declared without even touching the man. "He's probably drunk. Get a blood alcohol level, push 2 units of O-neg, and get him to a CT scan. Once you've confirmed the internal bleeding, page me. I'll deal with him after we've handled the paying customers." His dismissive tone was clear. This man was not a priority. He was an inconvenience. The nurses, following their commander's lead, quickly moved to attach an IV and prepare him for transport to the radiology department. "Vance!" a nurse called out. "You're not doing anything useful. Take this one down to CT. Try not to lose him on the way." Alara nodded numbly. Her hands felt cold as she took hold of the gurney's metal frame. She began to push the John Doe out of the bustling trauma bay, heading for the long, sterile corridor that led to the imaging suites. As she pushed, she looked down at the man. Something was wrong. It was a feeling deep in her gut, a discordant note in the symphony of chaos. Finch's diagnosis was too simple, too easy. It didn't fit. She stopped the gurney under an alcove, out of the main flow of traffic. The hospital's chaos faded into a low hum. Here, in this small bubble of quiet, she could finally think. Her training, buried under years of intentional neglect, began to surface like a body rising from the depths. Observe, assess, analyze. She looked at his skin. It was pale and clammy, consistent with shock from blood loss. But there was a faint bluish tint to his lips, a sign of cyanosis. His breathing was shallow, too shallow for a simple bleed. She gently lifted one of his eyelids. His pupils were constricted, like pinpricks. That wasn't right for a head injury. Her eyes scanned his body, moving with an efficiency that would have stunned her colleagues. She ignored the larger, more obvious cuts and bruises. She was looking for the subtlety, the detail that everyone else, including the great Dr. Finch, had missed. She noticed the strange pattern of the dirt on his clothes. It wasn't city grime. It was soil, rich and dark, with flecks of vegetation she didn't recognize. And the smell. It wasn't the stale stench of alcohol. It was a faint, acrid chemical odor, almost like bitter almonds, clinging to the fabric of his jacket. Her fingers, now deft and sure, traced the line of his jaw, feeling for fractures. And then she found it. Just below his ear, hidden in the grime and stubble of his beard, was a tiny, almost invisible mark. It wasn't a cut or a scrape. It was a puncture wound. 2 of them, side by side, no bigger than a pinprick. The skin around them was slightly red and inflamed. A switch flipped in her mind. The timid, clumsy nurse vanished. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone with different eyes, a different mind. Pinpoint pupils, cyanosis, shallow breathing. Bradycardia, she realized, as she felt for his pulse, which was dangerously slow. The acrid smell. The twin puncture wounds. It wasn't blunt force trauma. It was poisoning. A nerve agent. Specifically, a cholinesterase inhibitor. The internal bleeding Finch had assumed was the primary injury was a secondary symptom, a result of the toxin's violent effect on the body's systems. She knew, with absolute, chilling certainty, that the contrast dye used in a CT scan was a vasodilator. In a healthy patient, it was harmless. But in a body flooded with this specific class of neurotoxin, the dye would trigger a catastrophic, irreversible cascade. It would cause his blood vessels to rupture simultaneously. It would kill him in seconds. Finch's order wasn't a treatment. It was a death sentence. Her blood ran cold. She looked down the long white corridor toward the CT scanner, then back at the man on the gurney. He was a complete stranger, a nameless face the world had already discarded. Saving him meant defying Dr. Finch. It meant insubordination. It meant losing the quiet, anonymous life she had so carefully constructed. It meant her job, her nursing license, everything. She looked at the man's face again. In the harsh fluorescent light, she saw a small tattoo peeking out from under his collar. It was a winged dagger, a symbol she knew all too well. This was no vagrant. This was one of her own. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a duty. Finch was striding down the hall, his face a thundercloud. He had noticed the delay. "Nurse, what is the meaning of this? I gave you an order 10 minutes ago. Why isn't this patient in imaging?" Alara turned to face him. For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye. Her own eyes, usually downcast and timid, were now clear and steady, burning with a cold fire. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was calm, level, and carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "Doctor, we can't take him to CT." Finch stopped, taken aback by her tone. He blinked, as if seeing her for the first time. "What did you just say to me?" "The contrast dye will kill him," she stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. He hasn't suffered blunt force trauma. He's been poisoned. A nerve agent, most likely VX or a derivative. His symptoms are classic: meiosis, bradycardia, convulsions that are presenting as internal bleeding. The puncture wound on his neck is the injection site. Finch stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. A stunned silence fell over the hallway. A few nearby nurses and a resident froze, watching the unbelievable scene unfold. The mousy, incompetent new nurse was lecturing the chief of trauma surgery on toxicology. Then, his shock curdled into rage. He threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the corridor. Poisoned? A nerve agent? Have you lost your mind? You've been watching too many spy movies. He's a drunk, a worthless junkie who got in the way of a car. Now get him to the CT scanner, or I will personally escort you out of this hospital and have your license revoked for gross incompetence and insubordination. He took a step forward, intending to grab the gurney himself. No, Alara said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unyielding as granite. Finch's face turned a shade of purple. His voice dropped to a menacing hiss. Get out of my way, nurse. That is a direct order. Alara didn't move. She stood between Finch and the gurney, a small, unassuming woman transformed into an immovable object. She knew what she had to do. There was no time to argue. The toxin was working fast. The man had minutes, at most. With a sudden, fluid movement that defied her clumsy persona, she spun the gurney around and pushed it, not toward CT, but in the opposite direction, down a side corridor. Hey, stop! Finch roared, caught off guard by her speed. Alara ignored him. She moved with a desperate purpose, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. She rounded a corner and saw what she was looking for, a large, walk-in supply closet. She shoved the gurney inside, the man's body jostling with the movement. She turned to close the door, but Finch was already there, his face contorted with fury. He grabbed the edge of the door, trying to wrench it from her grasp. What in God's name do you think you're doing? I'm saving his life, she said, her voice strained as she struggled against his superior strength. He was too strong. He ripped the door open and lunged for her, but Alara was already moving. She sidestepped his clumsy grab, slammed her palm against the door's locking mechanism, and threw her weight against the heavy steel door. The lock clicked shut an instant before Finch crashed into it. He bellowed in rage, pounding on the door with his fists. Security! Get security to the south corridor! Now! We have a psychotic nurse who has taken a patient hostage. Inside the cramped, dark closet, Alara ignored the shouting. The only sounds were the patient's shallow, rattling breaths and the frantic thumping of her own heart. The room smelled of sterile bandages and rubbing alcohol. She flicked on the small overhead light. She had bought herself a few minutes, nothing more. She had to work fast. The standard hospital antidote for organophosphate poisoning was atropine, but it wouldn't be enough. She needed pralidoxime chloride, 2 PAM, to reactivate the cholinesterase. But where would she find it? Her eyes scanned the shelves, filled with boxes of catheters, bandages, and saline bags. Her mind, now operating at peak efficiency, was a finely tuned instrument. She remembered seeing a crash cart parked just down the hall. They sometimes carried advanced toxicology kits. It was a long shot. She looked at the patient. His seizures were getting worse. She ripped open his shirt. Tucked into a hidden pocket sewn into his waistband was a small, sealed pouch. Her fingers tore it open. Inside were 2 military-grade auto-injectors. One was filled with a high-dose combination of atropine and 2 PAM. The other was a diazepam injector to control the convulsions. He was prepared. He knew this was a possibility. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the cap off the first injector and slammed it into his thigh with the practiced, forceful motion of a combat medic. She held it there for a 10 count, then pulled it away. She did the same with the diazepam injector. Outside, the pounding on the door intensified. She could hear the jangle of keys as a security guard fumbled with the lock. Come on, she whispered to the unconscious man. His breathing was still dangerously shallow. The antidote needed time to work. The lock turned. The door flew open. 2 burly security guards stood there, with a furious Dr. Finch right behind them. There she is! She assaulted him! Get her! The guards rushed in. Alara stood up, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. There was no point in fighting them. The first part of her job was done. The man had a chance now. One of the guards grabbed her arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. The other checked on the patient. "He's still breathing," the second guard said. "Of course he is, no thanks to her," Finch spat. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "You are fired. Do you hear me? Fired! We're escorting you off the premises. And you can expect a lawsuit from this hospital and criminal charges from the police. You'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison." The guards dragged her from the closet. They pulled her through the corridors, a spectacle for the entire ER staff. Her colleagues stared, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a strange, morbid curiosity. Chloe looked like she was about to cry. Ben, the sycophant, just looked smug, pleased to see the weirdo get what she deserved. They didn't take her through the front entrance. They shoved her through a set of double doors at the back of the hospital, out into the service alley. The cold night air hit her like a slap in the face. A steady, miserable rain was falling, soaking her thin scrubs in seconds. "Your personal effects will be mailed to you," one of the guards grunted. "Don't ever show your face here again." They slammed the metal door shut, the sound echoing in the empty alley. Alara stood there, shivering in the rain. The adrenaline that had surged through her began to fade, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She had failed. Not the patient. She had saved him, but she had failed at being invisible. She had failed at being quiet. The life she had built from the ashes of her past was gone, destroyed in a matter of minutes. All for a man whose name she didn't even know. She wrapped her arms around herself and started walking, with no destination in mind. The rain plastered her hair to her face, mingling with the tears she no longer tried to hold back. Each step was heavy, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. What had she done? What was she going to do now? A pair of headlights cut through the darkness at the end of the alley. A large, black, unmarked van rolled to a silent stop, blocking her path. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Was it the police? The side door slid open with a quiet hiss. Two men in dark, tactical gear stepped out into the rain. They moved with a fluid, disciplined grace that was anything but police. They weren't cops. They were soldiers. One of them, a man with a shaved head and a grim expression, took a step towards her. "Alara Vance?" he asked. His voice was low and calm. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, her body trembling from the cold and the fear. "My name is Master Sergeant Graves," he said. "We're with General Maddox. We need you to come with us. Captain Thorne is not secure." Alara stared at him, confused. Captain Thorne? Then it clicked. The John Doe. The man with the winged dagger tattoo. How did you find me?" she stammered. Graves pointed to her shoulder. She looked down and saw a tiny, blinking red light on the collar of her scrubs. A tracking device. The patient must have planted it on her when she was treating him. A last, desperate act before he lost consciousness. "He knew he was compromised," Graves explained. "He activated his beacon. It led us to the hospital. But the beacon went dead a few minutes ago. We thought we'd lost him. Then we picked up a secondary signal. From you." "We need to go, ma'am," the other soldier said, his eyes scanning the rooftops. "This area is not secure." Alara hesitated for only a second. Her old life was over. This was something new, something terrifying, and something strangely familiar. She nodded and allowed Master Sergeant Graves to guide her into the warmth of the waiting van. As the van pulled away, a new sound filled the air, drowning out the rain and the city's hum. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping, growing louder and louder, the sound of helicopter rotors. At that very moment, the front of the hospital was thrown into chaos. Two MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, painted matte black and bristling with antennas, descended from the night sky. They didn't land on the designated helipad on the roof. They landed directly on the street in front of the main entrance, their rotor wash blasting cars, scattering debris, and sending terrified pedestrians running for cover. The rear ramps dropped before the skids even touched the pavement. Two squads of soldiers, clad in black tactical gear and carrying short-barreled rifles, stormed out. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, forming a perimeter and sweeping into the hospital's main lobby. The hospital security guards, used to dealing with drunks and distraught family members, were frozen in a state of shock and terror. They fumbled for their radios, their hands shaking. A man in a major's uniform, his face hard and impassive, strode to the front desk. The receptionist stared at him, her mouth wide open. "This facility is now under the authority of the United States Army," the major announced, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "No one enters or leaves without my authorization. We are looking for a high-value asset, and we are looking for the civilian who treated him. Her code name is Angel." Dr. Finch, having just returned to the ER, heard the commotion. His face, already flushed with his victory over Alara, turned pale. He rushed to the lobby, ready to assert his authority. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, puffing out his chest. "I am the chief of surgery here. Who is in command?" The major turned his cold, empty gaze on Finch. "I am." Just then, the black van pulled up to the curb, its doors sliding open. Master Sergeant Graves stepped out, followed by Alara. She was wrapped in a dry tactical jacket one of the soldiers had given her. She walked past the heavily armed men, her expression unreadable. The major saw her, and his entire demeanor changed. The hard-edged commander softened. He snapped to attention and gave her a sharp, respectful salute. "Ma'am, we've secured the asset. He's stable, just as you left him." Finch watched this exchange, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The soldiers were saluting the fired nurse. The incompetent, mousy woman was being addressed as ma'am by a combat officer. It didn't make any sense. Alara nodded to the major. "What's his status?" "The antidote is working. Vitals are stabilizing. But he's not out of the woods," the major reported. "We've secured him in a private room and have men on the door." Alara's gaze then fell on Dr. Finch. Her eyes, once so full of fear in his presence, were now like chips of ice. The major followed her gaze. He stepped towards Finch, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered on his hip. "Are you Dr. Alistair Finch?" Yes, I am," Finch stammered. "By order of General Samuel Maddox of the Joint Special Operations Command," the major said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are hereby relieved of all medical and administrative duties pertaining to this facility. Your authority here is terminated. Miss Vance is now in command of all medical care for Captain Thorne. You will give her and my men your full, unconditional cooperation. Is that understood?" Finch's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His face was a mask of utter disbelief and horror. The world had just turned upside down. The woman he had humiliated and fired was now his superior, backed by the full power of the United States military. Alara walked past him without a second glance, her focus already on her patient. "Take me to him," she said to the major. Her voice was no longer that of a nurse. It was the voice of a commander. They escorted her to a private room on the top floor. 2 soldiers stood guard outside, their rifles held at the ready. Inside, Captain Thorne lay on the bed, hooked up to a portable military-grade monitor. His breathing was deeper, more regular. The bluish tint was gone from his lips. Alara immediately went to work. She checked his vitals on the monitor, drew a blood sample to check the toxin levels, and administered another, smaller dose of the antidote. Her movements were economical and precise. She was no longer hiding. She was back in her element. A ruggedized laptop was set up on a nearby table. A moment later, the face of a stern, silver-haired man in a general's uniform appeared on the screen. "Sergeant Vance," he said. His voice was gravelly, but filled with respect. Alara didn't look up from her patient. "General Maddox, it's been a while." "I'm sorry to pull you back in like this, Alara," he said. "We didn't know where else to turn. When Thorne's beacon went active, your name was attached as his emergency medical proxy. We knew if anyone could keep him alive, it was you." "What happened to him, General?" she asked, adjusting the IV drip. "He was on a deep cover operation in South America," Maddox explained, his face grim. "He successfully retrieved intel on a new, weaponized neurotoxin being developed by a rogue biotech firm. The intel is on a microdrive implanted in his bicuspid. He was compromised during exfil. They hit him with the very agent he was investigating." Alara's blood ran cold. "This hospital isn't safe, then?" "No, it isn't," Maddox confirmed. "The people who want that intel are not amateurs. They're well-funded, and they have connections everywhere. They'll assume he's dead, but when he doesn't show up at the morgue, they'll come looking for him. We need to move him to a secure location. Meanwhile, in his office, Alistair Finch was falling apart. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was crumbling around him. It was all her fault. That quiet, pathetic nurse. She had somehow conspired against him, brought the full weight of the military down on his head. His personal cell phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He ignored it. It rang again. And again. Finally, he answered it, his voice trembling with rage. "What?" "Dr. Finch," a smooth, cold voice on the other end said. "You had a job to do. A certain John Doe was supposed to have an unfortunate accident in your operating room. He did not. This is a problem." Finch's heart hammered against his ribs. These were the people he owed money to. A series of bad investments and a gambling habit had left him deeply in debt to some very dangerous men. They had offered to wipe his slate clean in exchange for one small favor, ensuring a specific patient didn't survive surgery. "It wasn't my fault!" he hissed into the phone. "Some nurse interfered, and now the military is here. They've taken over." "We are aware of the military's presence," the voice said calmly. "This complicates things, but it does not change the objective. You are still on the inside. You will tell us where they are holding him. You will create a distraction. You will fix your mistake, doctor, or we will come to collect on your debt, and we will bring your family a condolence card." The line went dead. Finch stared at the phone, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He was trapped. He looked out his office window and saw the soldiers patrolling the hospital grounds. Betraying the military was treason, but defying the men on the phone was a death sentence for him and his family. He made his choice. He picked up the phone and sent a text message with the room number where Thorne was being held. Back in the patient room, Alara was monitoring Thorne's neurological responses. She noticed a subtle flicker in his eyelids. He was starting to come around. Suddenly, her finely honed senses screamed a warning. It was a change in the ambient noise of the hallway. A squeaking wheel that didn't sound right. The cadence of footsteps that was too deliberate. She looked at the hallway monitor, a small screen showing the camera feed from outside the door. A janitor was pushing a cleaning cart down the hall. He was moving slowly, his head down. But Alara's eyes weren't on his face. They were on his shoes. They were expensive, military-style tactical boots, barely scuffed. Not the worn-out sneakers of a hospital janitor. His posture was wrong, too. He wasn't slumped with fatigue. He was coiled like a spring, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. "We have a breach," she said, her voice low and urgent. The two soldiers in the room immediately raised their rifles, aiming at the door. The major, who was coordinating with General Maddox, drew his pistol. "He's an assassin," Alara said quickly. "He'll use the cart as cover. He'll have a suppressed weapon." There was no time to wait for him to make a move. Alara reacted on pure instinct. She unplugged the vital monitors, grabbed the IV pole, and with a surge of adrenaline shoved Thorne's entire bed. It rolled across the room with a loud groan, crashing against the far wall, out of the direct line of fire from the door. She was not a moment too soon. The janitor in the hallway made his move. He pulled a suppressed pistol from a hidden compartment in the cart and fired a rapid volley of shots through the wooden door. The bullets splintered the wood, punching neat, dark holes exactly where the head of the bed had been just seconds before. The soldiers returned fire, their rifles roaring in the confined space, shredding the door and the cleaning cart. The assassin was driven back, but the attack had served its purpose. It had confirmed their location. "The hospital is compromised," the major yelled over the ringing in his ears. "General, we have to bug out. Now." "Agreed," came Maddox's voice from the laptop. "Proceed to Rally Point Bravo. It's an off-grid facility. Vance knows the protocol." Alara was already preparing the patient for transport. She secured his lines, covered him with a thermal blanket, and checked the charge on the portable defibrillator. Her hands were a blur of efficient motion. The soldiers laid down covering fire while another team brought a tactical gurney. They transferred Thorne, who was now conscious but too weak to move. His eyes found Alara's. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He knew she had saved him. Again. They moved out, a tight formation of armed soldiers with Alara and the patient in the center. They didn't take the elevators. They took the service stairs, moving quickly and quietly down to the rear exit, where the black vans were waiting. As they burst back out into the rainy alley, chaos erupted. Two dark sedans screeched around the corner, their windows rolling down. Muzzles flashed in the darkness. The sharp crack of automatic rifle fire echoed off the brick walls. The mercenaries had been waiting for them. Alara threw her body over Thorn's, shielding him from the incoming fire. The soldiers returned fire, their superior training and equipment immediately apparent. The firefight was short, brutal, and decisive. Within 30 seconds, the sedans were smoking wrecks, their occupants neutralized. They loaded Thorn into the back of one of the vans. Alara climbed in beside him, immediately resuming her medical care. "Go! Go!" the major yelled, jumping into the passenger seat. The van's tires squealed as it sped out of the alley, leaving the chaos of the hospital behind. They were clear, but they were not safe. The enemy knew they had Thorn, and they knew he was alive. They would be coming for him, and for the woman who was keeping him that way. The rally point was a large, unassuming veterinary clinic nestled in the foothills of a national park, an hour's drive from the city. From the outside, it looked normal, complete with a cheerful sign featuring a cartoon dog and cat. On the inside, it was a state-of-the-art, hardened medical and tactical facility, one of dozens of black sites scattered across the country. They brought Captain Thorn into the sterile operating theater in the basement. Alara immediately hooked him up to the advanced monitors, her relief palpable. Here, she had everything she needed. "His toxin levels are dropping, but the secondary effects are setting in," she reported to the major. "The nerve agent caused microhemorrhages in his organ tissues. I need to stabilize him, or he'll go into organ failure." For the next few hours, she worked tirelessly. She was no longer just a medic. She was a surgeon, a pharmacist, a scientist. She cross-referenced Thorn's blood work with the data from the microdrive, which a technician had carefully extracted, to create a customized cocktail of drugs to counteract the toxin's specific cellular damage. Above them, the soldiers fortified the clinic. They set up a perimeter, deployed motion sensors in the surrounding woods, and established a satellite communications link with General Maddox's command center. They were a small island of order in a sea of unknown danger. As dawn approached, Thorn's condition finally stabilized. Alara, exhausted but satisfied, sat on a stool beside his bed, watching his vitals on the monitor. The major brought her a cup of steaming coffee. "You're incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine awe. "I've served with the best medics in the world. I've never seen anything like that." Alara just shrugged, taking a sip of the coffee. "I just did my job." Her words were interrupted by a sharp beep from the tactical command station set up in the next room. A soldier called out, "Sir, we have multiple contacts approaching. Fast, from all directions." The major ran to the monitor. It showed a dozen heat signatures moving through the trees, closing in on their position. "They found us," he breathed. "How did they find us?" Alara's mind raced. Finch. He must have put a tracker on something, or someone. The equipment, the gurney. No, he wouldn't have had time. It had to be one of the soldiers. Or her. She quickly scanned her own clothes, her jacket. Nothing. Then she looked at Thorn, at the small personal effects bag the hospital had sent with him. Inside was his grimy wallet. And tucked into one of the sleeves was a new, crisp business card for a law firm. It felt thicker than normal. She tore it open. Embedded in the cardstock was a tiny GPS transmitter. Finch had planted it before they left. "They're here," the major said, his voice grim. "It's a full-scale assault." The quiet of the morning was shattered by the sound of an explosion. One of the perimeter defenses had been triggered. The siege had begun. The clinic, built for this very purpose, went into lockdown. Steel shutters slammed down over the windows. The quiet veterinary office transformed into a concrete bunker. The firefight was intense. The mercenaries were professionals, well-equipped and determined. They laid down a heavy base of fire, trying to pin the soldiers down, while another team attempted to breach the building's main entrance. Alara was in the operating theater with Thorn and two soldiers. Bullets ricocheted off the steel shutters outside, the sound like angry hornets. The building shook from a nearby explosion. Suddenly, Thorn's monitor began to shriek in alarm. His blood pressure was crashing. "He's bleeding internally again," Alara shouted over the din of the battle. "The shock from the explosions must have ruptured one of the damaged vessels. I have to open him up. Now!" She worked under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The lights flickered. The ground trembled. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and dust. With steady hands, she made an incision, her focus absolute. She was in a bubble of concentration, the chaos of the battle outside fading into a distant roar. She was saving a life, and that was the only thing that mattered. The battle raged for almost an hour. The small team of soldiers was holding its own, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The mercenaries finally managed to breach the main door using a shaped charge.
"They're inside," the major yelled over the comms. "Fall back to the lower level. Defend the OR."
Alara could hear the sounds of fighting getting closer. The exchange of gunfire, the shouts, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. She finished the procedure, closing the last suture just as the steel door to the operating room buckled from a massive impact. Thorne was stable, but unconscious. The two soldiers in the room took up positions on either side of the door, their rifles trained on the entrance. The door buckled again, its hinges groaning in protest. Thorne's eyes fluttered open. He was weak, but his mind was clear. He looked at Alara, then at the groaning door. He reached down and unstrapped a sidearm from the holster on his ankle. He held it out to her. "You know what to do, Angel," he whispered, his voice raspy. Alara looked at the gun, then back at him. Her past came rushing back. The dust, the smoke, the screams of her fallen comrades. The weight of the weapon in her hand was a heavy, terrible memory. For years, she had run from this moment, from the person she used to be, but there was nowhere left to run. She took the pistol. Her grip was sure, her hands steady. She was no longer just a nurse. She was Sergeant Alara Vance, para-rescue jumper. She was a warrior. The door burst open with a deafening crash. The lead mercenary, a mountain of a man in heavy body armor, stormed in, his rifle raised. Before the two soldiers could even react, Alara fired. 2 shots, so close together they sounded like one. Crack, crack, the classic double tap. Both rounds hit the mercenary in the small, unprotected gap between his helmet and his ballistic vest. He dropped like a stone, his rifle clattering to the floor. The element of surprise was total. Before the other mercenaries could process what had happened, the two soldiers opened fire, cutting them down in the doorway. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in Alara's ears and the soft beeping of Thorne's heart monitor. She stood there, the pistol still held in a perfect firing stance, smoke curling from its barrel. She had not forgotten. She had never forgotten. Just then, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air again. This time, it was the cavalry. A fleet of Blackhawks and Apache gunships descended on the clinic, and the remaining mercenaries either surrendered or were eliminated. The siege was over. The aftermath was a swift military operation. The wounded were treated, the prisoners secured, and the clinic scrubbed of any evidence of the battle. By midday, there was nothing left but the pockmarked trees and the lingering smell of cordite to show that anything had happened at all. The next day, the scene shifted back to the city. General Maddox had called a press conference in the main auditorium of the very hospital where the ordeal had begun. The room was packed with reporters, television cameras, and curious hospital staff. Dr. Alistair Finch was there, standing near the podium. He had been invited to give his account of the events. He looked confident, smug even. He had spent the last 24 hours crafting a narrative that would make him the hero. He would paint Alara as a disturbed, unstable nurse who had endangered a patient, and describe how he, Dr. Finch, had bravely tried to manage the ensuing gang-related violence that had inexplicably followed. General Maddox stepped up to the podium, his face grim. Yesterday, this hospital and its staff were caught in the middle of a national security incident, he began. There has been a great deal of speculation. Today, I am here to set the record straight. He briefly outlined the events, describing a thwarted terrorist plot without giving away any classified details. Then he turned to Finch. Dr. Finch played a key role in these events. Doctor, would you care to share your perspective? Finch stepped forward, a practiced, concerned look on his face. Thank you, General. It was a terrifying ordeal. We had an unstable employee, a nurse named Alara Vance, who tragically suffered a psychotic break. She kidnapped a patient, and her actions, unfortunately, drew a violent gang element to our doors. I did my best to protect my patients and my staff in a situation of unprecedented chaos. He was lying with a breathtaking shamelessness. He looked out at the crowd, expecting to see sympathetic faces. A compelling story, Doctor, General Maddox said, his voice laced with ice. But it's not the truth.
The large screen behind the podium, which had been showing the hospital's logo, flickered to life. It showed a grainy, zoomed-in video. It was the security footage from Finch's office. The audio was crystal clear. It was the recording of his phone call with the mercenaries. His voice filled the auditorium, selling out Thorne's location, agreeing to help them. A collective gasp went through the room. Finch's face went white. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, sickly gray. That's a fake, he sputtered. It's doctored. A lie. Is it? Maddox continued, his voice like thunder. We also have your financial records. The large, unexplained payments from a shell corporation owned by the same biotech firm that developed the neurotoxin. The same firm that hired the mercenaries to retrieve their stolen property. The auditorium doors at the back of the room opened. Alara walked in, flanked by 2 military police officers. She was wearing a dress uniform, her chest adorned with a row of ribbons, the Air Force cross prominent among them. She walked with a confidence that stunned everyone who had known her as the timid, mousy nurse. Finch stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He saw Chloe and Margaret in the audience, their faces streaked with tears of vindication and relief. "It's her!" Finch shrieked, his composure shattering completely. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "She's the one! She set me up! This is all her fault!" 2 federal agents stepped forward from the side of the stage. "Dr. Alistair Finch," one of them said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and attempted murder." They snapped handcuffs on his wrists. Finch began to sob, a pathetic wailing sound. "No, you can't do this to me. I'm a doctor. I'm the chief of surgery." He was a broken man, his arrogance and pride stripped away, leaving only a weeping, terrified core. They dragged him away, his protests echoing down the hall until they faded into nothing. General Maddox stepped back to the podium. He waited for the room to quiet down. "Let me introduce you to the real hero of this story," he said, gesturing to Alara. "This is Sergeant Alara Vance, United States Air Force Pararescue. 2 years ago, on a mission in Afghanistan, Sergeant Vance's helicopter was shot down. Despite her own severe injuries, she shielded 3 wounded soldiers from a secondary explosion, saving their lives at great cost to herself. The IED attack killed the rest of her team and left her with scars, both visible and not. For her actions, she was awarded the Air Force Cross." He paused, letting the information sink in. "She left the service seeking a quiet life, to heal. But when duty called, she did not hesitate. She risked everything to save a fellow soldier, and in doing so, she saved this nation from a threat you will never know. She is the finest medic, the finest soldier I have ever had the privilege of serving with." The room erupted in thunderous applause. Reporters were shouting questions. Cameras flashed like lightning. Alara stood tall, her eyes clear, accepting the recognition not with pride, but with a quiet, solemn grace. Maddox held up a hand for silence. "The Department of Defense is forming a new elite unit, a rapid response medical tactical team designed to operate in the most hostile environments on Earth. It needs a leader, someone with a unique combination of medical genius and battlefield command experience." He looked directly at Alara. "Sergeant Vance, we want you to run it. We want you to come home." Alara looked out at the crowd, at the life she was leaving behind. Then she looked at the general, the man who represented the life that was her true calling. A small smile touched her lips. "I accept, General." Later that day, she visited Captain Thorne in the secure military wing of the hospital. He was sitting up in bed, looking weak but on the mend. He smiled when she walked in. "I heard they gave you a promotion." "Something like that," she said, checking his chart. "I knew it, you know," he said softly. "The moment I saw you. Even through the fog, I could tell. You have the eyes of a warrior." He paused. "Thank you, Angel. You saved my life." "Just doing my job, Captain," she replied, but her voice was warm. "Just doing my job." She walked out of the hospital for the last time, not through the back alley into the cold rain, but through the grand front entrance, into the bright, warm sunlight. She was no longer a ghost, no longer hiding. She was Sergeant Alara Vance, a hero who had finally found her way back to the light. Her past was not a burden to be hidden, but a source of strength, and her future was waiting. She walked towards it, leaving the shadows behind for good. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. The story of Alara Vance teaches us a powerful lesson about judging others. On the surface, she was seen as incompetent and weak, but underneath, she possessed incredible strength, skill, and courage. It reminds us that true character isn't about the title you hold or the authority you project, but about what you do when faced with a difficult choice. Dr. Finch's arrogance was his downfall, while Alara's quiet integrity made her a hero. It shows that doing the right thing, even when it's hard and comes at a personal cost, is always the path to true vindication. Never judge a book by its cover, because you never know when you might be in the presence of a silent hero. What would you have done if you were in Alara's position? Would you have risked your entire career to save a stranger based on your gut feeling and training? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Have a nice rest of your day.